Was the bitter winter of 1944, and across the English countryside, the war had left its scars. Roads were cratered, fences broken, and one's golden fields turned to mud by the endless movement of troops. The war in Europe was reaching its climax. Allied forces had crossed into Germany and across Britain. Camps filled with captured enemy soldiers, some hardened men, some barely out of their teens, stood quiet behind barbed wire. But in a few of those camps, the prisoners were not men. They were women who had served as nurses, clerks, and assistants in the crumbling Nazi war machine. When they arrived, everyone expected harsh treatment, resentment, even hate. But something entirely different happened. Inside one such camp, near the small town of Shrewsbury, British soldiers gathered along the wire to see the new arrivals. The morning was gray and cold, fog curling through the frost-covered grass. Trucks rumbled in, bringing with them about 40 German women, most young, their uniforms patched, faces pale from exhaustion and defeat. Some were visibly frightened, others tried to hide it, their postures stiff and proud, still clinging to the discipline of the army they once served. The British guards watched in silence. They had expected tough prisoners, spies maybe, fanatics who would spit at them. Instead, they saw frightened women, shivering in torn coats. A few soldiers exchanged glances. Others simply looked away, unsure of what to feel. The officer in charge, Captain John Whitmore, stood with his clipboard and sharp blue eyes, determined to enforce discipline. But even he noticed the hesitation in his men's eyes as the prisoners climbed down, one after another, into the cold mud. "Get them settled in the East Wing," he ordered curtly. "Standard rations. No special treatment." Yet, that night, something unexpected began. One of the guards, Private Alan Reeve, noticed one of the women couldn't have been older than 20 sitting in the corner of the barracks, quietly crying into her hands. She had lost her brother at the front, and she whispered something about never seeing her family again. Alan, unsure what to do, left his post for a moment and brought her a steaming mug of tea from the mess hall. It was a small act, barely noticed, but it was the first crack in a wall of suspicion that soon began to crumble. Over the following weeks, a strange atmosphere settled over the camp. The women, though prisoners, were treated with a civility that astonished even visiting officers. British soldiers who had once fought bitterly against the Wehrmacht now found themselves helping German women fix broken boots, teaching them English words, even sharing cigarettes over the fences. It wasn't sympathy for the enemy. It was something simpler, human decency in a world that had almost forgotten it. The women, in turn, began to open up. Many had been nurses at field hospitals. Some volunteers caught up in the chaos of war spoke of tending to the wounded, of blood and noise and hopelessness. They spoke of bombing raids that shattered their towns. Slowly, their stories stripped away the label of enemy. To the British guards, these were no longer the Germans. They were just people, tired, frightened, and longing for peace. Captain Whitmore noticed the change. One afternoon, while inspecting the camp, he saw his men talking and laughing with the prisoners. He frowned. "You're getting too familiar," he warned them. "They are still prisoners of war." But even he couldn't ignore what he saw next. The women had started tending the camp garden, turning the muddy patch by the fence into rows of green sprouts. They mended uniforms, cleaned the barracks, and even helped in the camp kitchen. The discipline of the German nurse corps merged with British practicality, and soon the place felt less like a prison and more like a community. One cold morning, Major Harris from headquarters arrived, unannounced. He had come to inspect conditions. The moment he stepped into the camp, his brows lifted. "Good heavens," he muttered. "These women are better fed than our own soldiers." Captain Whitmore stiffened. "They work hard, sir. It keeps order." Harris raised an eyebrow. "This looks more like a schoolyard than a prison." But that night, after seeing the guards and prisoners quietly sharing tea in the mess hall, Harris said nothing more. Perhaps he understood that this quiet humanity, what separated them from the chaos raging across Europe. By early 1945, the camp had become famous among nearby villagers. Locals would sometimes visit the perimeter fence, offering bread, fruit, or flowers to the German women. In return, the women would wave, smiling shyly, or offer small, handmade crafts. Word reached London that British soldiers were spoiling the enemy. A few journalists came, expecting to find scandal. Instead, they found something so simple and decent that their pens fell silent. Private Reeve, the same young guard who had once given tea to the crying girl, had learned her name Anna. She was from Hamburg and had joined the Red Cross at 8. They spoke whenever he was on duty, practicing bits of English and German. One night, when snow blanketed the camp, she gave him a small hand-stitched handkerchief. "For your kindness," she said quietly. He smiled, but the next day he was reassigned to another post. They never spoke again. Yet, he kept that handkerchief for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, across the camp, other small stories bloomed. Letters exchanged secretly, songs hummed in 2 languages, laughter that echoed through the fences. The officers might have frowned, but even they began to see the effect. Morale among the British guards was higher than ever. There was no rebellion, no disorder, only a strange sense of peace amid war. The war finally ended in May 1945. The order came down. All POWs were to be repatriated. The women packed what little they had, mostly gifts from the soldiers' scarves, rationed chocolate, paper notes, with addresses, just in case. On their last night, the camp held a small concert. One of the British soldiers played the violin, and one of the German women sang softly, her voice trembling but clear. Even the hardest men wiped their eyes. When the trucks came at dawn, the women climbed aboard. The British soldiers lined the road, saluting quietly as the vehicles rolled away. Captain Whitmore stood at attention, his face unreadable. But as the last truck passed, one of the women, Nana, leaned out and waved the same handkerchief she had given Private Reeve. For a moment, the war, the hatred, the boundaries, all of it disappeared in the morning mist. After the war, many of the men returned home. A few received letters, written in careful English, from Germany. Some were even invited to visit years later, when Europe began to heal. In quiet towns across Britain and Germany, unlikely friendships endured. Born in a prison camp, where enemies learned they could still be human, historians later studied those camps, puzzled at the reports of kindness. They found no records of abuse, no violence, no revenge. Instead, they found stories of compassion that defied the logic of war. It turned out that the British soldiers had not just followed orders, they had followed conscience. For decades, those stories remained hidden in personal diaries, in letters tucked into drawers, in faded photographs of soldiers standing beside the women they were once told to hate. But for those who lived it, it was unforgettable. They had seen the best of humanity at a time when the world was showing its worst. And that's how, in the heart of a world at war, a small camp in Shrewsbury became a symbol of quiet dignity, proof that even when orders demanded distance, the human heart could not help but reach across the wire.